It's How to Draw. I'm Levi Smith. Today, we're going to draw a Jolly Roger. This is going to be a long one. Start with a circle. Make sure you draw with light lines at first. I'm using a pen, but you can use a pencil so that you can erase later. Draw a center line down the center of the circle. Add a triangle at the bottom of the circle. Add these large ovals on either side of the center line. Remember to keep your lines light at this stage. We'll add some smaller circles inside the large ovals. Then an oval from the triangle downward. And add a horizontal line halfway down the oval. I'm just going to add these straight lines along the ovals at the top, flattening the sides. This is kind of a simplified Loomis method called the Rodgon method. Bring this curved line from the side to the bottom of this lower oval, and again on the other side. Now we could use this structure to draw any face, but for this one, we're doing a skull. Add this line across the forehead for the brim of the hat, and draw out this U shape here at the top. This is the top of the hat flaps. Draw these guidelines out from the head, just slightly lower than the hat brim. Make sure each side is about the same length. I use my pen to measure these lines. These little lines up the top angle out for the rest of the hat. Draw this line scoop downward, and then cut it towards the lines here. Remember to keep the same curve for the other side, and cut it down to the brim line. At about the eye line, draw this line out and up for the back edge of the hat, and again for the other side. Before drawing these cross lines, I plan out the path with my hand for where I'm going to draw the line. As I draw this guideline, I draw it very light and avoid drawing it over the face, but I still follow the path to keep the line continuous. And again on the other side, I follow the path where I want my line to go before drawing it, keeping in mind where the line starts and ends. Again, follow through, but don't draw the line through the face. With these guidelines, I can plot out this cutlass sword, which will have a slight curve. Draw out the blade with a curve at the front. Don't draw it out too far, we need room for the handle. I'll add this curve to end the blade. Then a guideline for the handle, centering that guide on the blade. I'll add these rounded curves on either side of the guideline. They're a little too round though. This circle I draw for the pommel is lopsided, but easily corrected. From here, we'll add the shapes for the femur bone. I draw in these classic dog bone shapes at the end, but keep things a little irregular. Notice how I use the guideline as the top line of the bone, giving me more room for the bone since it's so close to the hat. So for the lower segment of the bone, I'll add the bottom line, making sure it follows the trajectory of the upper portion. Add the dog bone shape here at the end, and this is our shape layouts. From here, we'll start adding some details. Going back to the face, draw a line across the forehead just above the eye circles. Add a couple of angled lines that kind of overlap each other, and add some simple squiggles down the sides. These are the bandana wraps. Now, to give this face some character. Starting from the center, I plot out an angled line to cross over this eye circle. With that line, I'll add another angled line to establish an eyebrow. Then I'll expand the size of the circle into an eye socket. Notice the inner line of the eye socket is sort of parallel to the nose triangle line. For the other eye, I want to add a patch. So I'll draw out this shape around the eye circle, making it just a little bigger than the eye socket itself. And then add the lines for the patch strip. Then, on the sides, I just want to define the temples of the skull, going inward toward the eye and back out for the cheekbones. I draw on these lines for the cheekbones, kind of following the curve of our original circle, but lumpy. Notice that the lines are mostly horizontal as they line up with the bottom line of the nose triangle. From the cheekbone lines, along the lines made for our mouth oval, I draw the sides of the teeth palette. From here, we'll define the nose. Add this V notch at the top. Draw out a simple diamond shape, leaving off the bottom. Hook the bottom lines of the diamond up and inward. A couple of parallel lines inside the diamond divide the nasal passages. We'll move to these cheek hollows. A simple oval shape establishes these areas. On the outer edge of the jaw, have your lines curve inward. As you work your lines towards the chin, give them a slight curve inward toward the skull. An upside down V gives us a big cleft in the chin. Starting on the mouth, draw a vertical center line intersecting the horizontal mouth line we drew earlier. From there, draw these tall triangle shapes and continue with these from the center to the edge. Repeat this on the other side. Do the same shape, flipped for the bottom, matching the lines to the top row of teeth. I add these lines along the jaw and the inner part of the mandible. These little V shapes between the teeth help build up this area. I also add these to the bottom teeth. Let's reinforce the sword. I'll darken the lines of the blade, adding some chips to the edge. For the handguard, let's add another line that follows the first one. That will give this shape more form. Add a thin line that defines the edge of the blade. This bit here helps the blade look more supported by the handle, and I'll fix the shape of this handle, flattening out the sides. Add these diagonal lines along the handle for a grip. Jumping to the hat, I'll add this double line reinforcement along the outside edge of the hat. On just this side, I'll add a wrinkle in the line. After I have the hat lines darkened, I'll add a few lines up here to show the fold between the panels of the hat. Have that line go to the bottom of the brim. And let's reinforce that brim line, making it a bit darker and thicker. For that wrinkle I drew earlier, I'm going to draw this line into the hat like a cut, then add some stitches to that cut line. On the opposite panel, I'll add these parallel lines and then cross them with another set of parallel lines, making a stitched X for a bit of a lived-in detail. This line between these panels is for the crown of the hat. Even though small, this element adds a lot of depth to the piece overall. I do a quick adjustment, aligning the crown with the outer corner of the hat. Moving to the femur bone, we'll add some overlaps in the joint structure. These squiggle lines establish the ridge of the ball joint. Notice I add little angles and areas in the outer lines that I use as a guide for these internal details. As I reinforce the upper part of this bone, I'll add more detail to the underside where there will be more shadow. These other details in the bone add texture. For the lower section of the bone, I drew the end a bit wonky, so I'll adjust this bottom area, adding in more bone detail, along with the internal details similar to the upper portion. A few extra detail lines to show form and texture. It probably would have been easier to add these at an earlier stage, but let's add some ropes or cords tied around the bone here and there. I use loose parallel lines that crisscross, and just wrap the bone with a few groups of this cord. Add some lines straight down for some charms to hang from. Do the same for the upper section. Some crisscross parallel lines. Not all of these have to have a string for doodads though. Let's add some little bones tied to this one. Make sure to add the knot around each bone. Just some simple beads on this one. Just make sure that your beads are bigger than the cord thickness. We'll add a coin or a washer to this cord up here. And for this other one, I'll add some little bones tied to the bone. Going back to the sword handle, I'll curve out the grip with this S line. And we'll do a few reinforcement lines in this area before going back to the eyes. I'll reinforce the lines of the eye socket and the nose. And add this ridge line to the nose along the side and off the top. Adding in just a bit of the eyebrow here under the eye patch. Reinforcing the temples and cheekbones. These nasal spaces above the cheekbones have indents we'll mark out here, along with adding in a ridgeline to the cheekbones we'll use for shading later. A few small details before boldening the edge lines to the teeth. A little divot under the nose cavity. Darken the outer line of the jaw and in the hollow of the cheeks. Some of these details can be tricky, but let's add these reinforcement lines between the upper and lower teeth. Reinforce the underline of the top teeth, then the overline of the bottom teeth. It's better to think of it that way while you're drawing it so that you can actually place the line just where it needs to go. Then, this line tucks the teeth into the skull. It's not really needed, but I do think it adds a lot. Make sure that the line curves outward from the center, and make sure to follow that pattern for the effect to work. More reinforcements for the sword. We'll move to the detail work on the bandanas. Reinforce the underline here. Add some crease lines. Keep these at the edges of the bandana folds, following the squiggle lines we added earlier. Continue this pattern for each layer of the bandana. Let's make the hat brim line darker and thicker again, as well as reinforce the outer lines of the hat. I add a bit of damage detail here that I could have done without. We'll continue reinforcing the outer lines of the hat before adding this trim line to the edges of the brim. The footage does get a bit shaky here and there. I'll try to minimize that in future videos. Add a small circle to the center of the eye patch. And that is the details. From here we'll do some shading while I keep using this pen. You can use markers or something else if that's easier for you. I'll start by shading in the eye socket. I find it's best to start with the darker, more obvious areas to shade and work your way out, building and layering shades as you go. Next, we'll shade the nasal cavity and the cheek hollows. While my hand is covering the process, we'll shade in the straps to the eye patch before shading the eye patch. The eye patch can be a little tricky here. It's not a hole like the eye socket, so I'm going to shade the opposite end darker and allow some highlights along the top right edge. Add this bit of shading in the crown of the hat, and then move to the underside of the hat where I want to shade along the original guidelines we added. At first, I'm just lightly filling in these shaded areas. We'll definitely darken things up as we go. These other elements catch a shadow from the skull, so we'll add these in. As you can see, they really push the skull shape forward. While the shadows are needed on both sides, they should be darker and heavier on the bottom left of all of the elements, because our light is coming from the top right. Add in the shading cue to the handle. Notice the U-shapes I'm making in the ridge of the handle already give it added form and depth. And a bit more adjustment to the pommel. I'll be using the old awkward lines as shading cues. Always shade opposite your light source and keep this consistent through the whole piece. Add the shading to the grip. Then some detail shading for the femur bone, shading the undersides and bottom third of the bone itself. Same for the lower portion, we'll add a few other details here and there. Now let's darken some of these areas, starting back with the eye socket. I'll mark out the darkest shadow area based on our lighting. I'll shade that darker area before adding more shade to the rest of the socket. I do want it dark, but that ridge should be darkest. For the eye patch, I'll add this darker edge on the bottom left as I shade it. I want to make sure that I maintain the dark light relationships on this eye patch. Add a small shadow off the circle in the middle, a pearl, I imagine. If you don't vibe with the gritty style of this hatch shading, markers will make all of this so much smoother. Darken in the cheek hollows. I darken the nasal cavity, and for the piece that separates the nostrils, I'll shade it from the top down to push that part into the shadow. A few more details around the nose here. I'll move back to the underside of the hat, adding a layer of hatching to these areas. Keep in mind, I do speed up parts of the video here and there just to keep things moving at a good pace. This drawing took me about an hour to draw in real time. Adding another darker layer under the hat. Notice I do these hatching lines in different directions each time to build up the saturation with my pen, keeping the darker parts under that guideline in the hat and off the left edges of the skull, and then shade out the rest of this underside. Next, I want to darken the outer lines of the skull quite a bit here, separating it even more from the bone and the sword. The right side doesn't need to be as thick as it's in the light, but we can add a bit here and there. Reinforce some lines in the bandanas and add a few details. And add some more light shading to the left side of the skull. I shade from under the bandanas and along the underside of the cheekbones where we drew these guides earlier. And add a bit more along the nose and under the eyebrow, just on the left side. A few other small details here and shading on the eyebrow before moving along. There's this space above the eyebrow ridge that goes in a little bit, and we shade that in here. Some shading in the jawbone and along the bottom of the chin. Little by little, these layers of hatch shading add up to some cool effects. I darken in a tooth. You don't have to do this part. Coloring one in yellow would probably have a better effect. More fussing over the details before adding a touch of shading to the side of the palette here, and another light layer on the left side of the jaw. Shade in the underside of the right cheekbone. Add a small shadow on the jaw just under the cheekbone before adding a few bits of light shading just where the light wouldn't hit as much. Notice I kind of shade the teeth by adding a slightly darker line here and there. For a lot of these smaller details, just adding a darker edge line is all you're going to need. More shading on the left palette and chin before adding just a bit more to the eyebrow. This stage of a drawing is called just a little bit more. A few nasal ridge details on the right and some shading under the eyebrow, under the eye patch. Build up the eye patch a little bit more. Moving to the sword blade, I add a bit of hatching from the handle, giving these elements a bit of separation, along with this other light shading behind the skull. Add some details to the edge of the blade. I want to make it look used and a bit worn down. And fuss over a few bits of shading here and there. Moving to the top of the blade, I'll add a bit of light shading near the skull. Notice how I don't carry this shading over the line for the blade edge, helping to keep it look sort of sharp. A few more details on the edge here, and we'll sharpen the point of the sword. Darken in a few shadows here and there as planned. Adding in this darker line to the sword handle will give it a bit more dimension and volume. And like the skull, these outer lines should be darker on the bottom left areas. See, this pommel shape sorted out just fine. I'm going to reinforce the cords tied around the bone, giving them a bit more thickness at the top and bottom. And just adding a thicker line to one side can add volume and shadow to these smaller details. This jiggling camera gets pretty rough here. I am sorry about that. More tiny details, and darkening anything that goes behind something else. I'll build up these outer lines around this joint section. It's hard to show these parts when my hand is in the way. Adding in these additional details to the bone actually builds up a sense of shading and shadow. I'm going to shade just the underside of these cords. It should all be easier to see here at this lower portion of the bone. Let's extend the shadow off the jaw. Shade the undersides of the cords around the bone. A few extra details to add shadow to the bone. It's an interesting thing how density of detail can add a shading effect. I'm just going to add these other cords tied around the bone. These beads are a great example of how just thickening part of the outline creates volume and shadow. Just a little bit more fussing here and there before shading some of the joint section. Darkening a few lines does a lot for these little bones. Let's jump to the X stitching in the hat. I'll add some little half circles around the ends of the stitch, for the puncture holes and fill in the open space left in the circles. Shade the areas that underlap the other chord and darken the line of the top chord. Then I'll add this light shading under the chords, a little heavier on the lower left sides. Next, we'll build up this other cut in the hat by darkening the line and adding stitches. Then it's time to add a bit of shading to the left panel of the hat, following that front fold line as a guide. Add another layer from the outer tip toward the center fold, keeping to the lower portion of the hat. Bring that shading right up to the fold line at the center of the hat. We'll add a bit of lighter shading to the right-hand side, and we'll darken the shading in the crown, adding a bit across the front. After I fuss over a few more details, we'll add some shading to the bandanas, this time shading down the bandana. Keep the line direction on this shading aligned with that fold pattern of the bandana fabric. I'll layer this up with a few light passes, building up the shadow from the brim of the hat, and add in a few extra details as needed. Another layer of shading on the left side of the hat fold, and darken the edge line of the blade, along with a bit more fussing here and there. As we get to the end here, I want to thank you for watching along. If you liked the video, give it a like and subscribe. Any questions, comments, or criticisms, you know where to put them. And I had a friend ask why I didn't sign the last few pieces, so maybe I'll do that more here. Check out my Patreon page, merch, art books, and social links in the description. Have a good one out there, and we'll catch you later.